Morning, everyone. Great pleasure to be here. To talk about this really important opportunity, and just been reflecting last few days, the obvious election backdrop, and knowing some of the things that are to come. Thank you, Hannah. But there's something about this decade, maybe because we haven't named it properly. It wasn't the teenies. It just doesn't feel like the end of a decade somehow, and yet it is. And we're standing on the edge of a new decade. So, despite any trepidation we may feel to do with the fiscal outlook and other things for that matter, I think holding on to the opportunities we do have and spotting what are the opportunities to turn the tide on poverty in Scotland against the odds, against a headwind. It's really important that we hold on to that kind of search for what can be done in this space, because a lot can be done. You probably know quite a bit about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Joseph Rowntree was first and foremost an industrialist who did indeed make his money from a chocolate factory, and he and his brothers put all their wealth into 4 or 5 different trusts and foundations, so as well as JRF, which does research and development and social change. We run a housing trust. We run care services. We run parks and gardens. So we're not a think tank. We're not just a think tank. We also have that heritage of industrialists and philanthropists. And so the roots are about good work, actually. So it's really appropriate that we talk today about the place of good work and how that can be a contribution to solving poverty in Scotland. I always say this, it isn't me, but it is my colleague Paul Brooke in our media team, and this is a really simple graphic that shows some of the modern locks, if you like, that keep people in poverty. We're going to talk mainly about the place of low-paid and insecure work and the rise of in-work poverty. So 20 years ago, when then Prime Minister Tony Blair surprised everyone, because it wasn't in the manifesto, and said we set out to end child poverty by next year, in-work poverty was the minority experience of poverty in Scotland and the UK. It is now the more common face of poverty. But that takes its place alongside housing costs, which I'll say just a little bit about, because it's really important that we don't just see work in isolation. A benefits freeze that is due to end next April, but that will be 4 full years of working age, the bulk of working age Social Security being frozen, at the same time that we've seen a rising cost of living. And what we know about people who are in poverty, they face a higher effective rate of inflation, the poverty premium, because a higher share of family incomes are being spent on fuel, and food and transport, the basics. And whatever else happens about Brexit, the IFS have told us that the uncertainty and the planning and preparation for Brexit has added inflation, and therefore the rising cost of living has borne down already upon people who are on the lowest incomes. I want to say a word really briefly about an analysis we brought out in October by my colleague Emma Congreve. So we do this every year. The thing that we are known best for is being a place to get the facts, and this is our annual monitor on the state of the nation, thinking about poverty in Scotland. And this year we looked specifically at the role of housing and what this tells us. So the blue line, the second one from the top. This is Scotland after housing costs, and it's the child poverty rate. And you can see it begins in the devolution years, going back 20 years, more or less the same as the rest of the UK. And you can see the divergence that takes place over the last 20 years, ending with, so the punchline is, child poverty is 6 percentage points lower, 60,000 children fewer in poverty in Scotland than if we had the same housing profile and the same housing policies as the rest of the UK. So for neatness, we are doing violence to the rest of the UK and lumping them all together. Apologies for that, but it does show us quite starkly that both our housing tenure, the choices we made in housing policy, and fundamentally lower average housing costs in every sector, especially social rents, combine to create a really important contribution, a really important advantage in Scotland's task of solving poverty. It's an advantage we should not put at risk. So the Scottish Government is doing some bold and brave consultation around housing to 2040. We quickly need to know what the bridge is going to be beyond the 2021 election, so that the momentum we are now seeing around affordable housing is maintained and not lost. Despite that, and there's a really excellent briefing paper in your pack today that shows this, broken down by working status in Scotland, we know, and this blue line is child poverty in Scotland, we know that after a period of improvement and then stalling, child poverty is set to go back up across the new decade. Now, forecasting is not fate. This is not what will happen. It's what's most likely to happen unless we make different choices, fundamentally in the labour market and housing and social security, at a UK level as well as a Scottish level. But what you'll see in the red lines, the first one is the interim target Scotland has committed to by 2023-24, and the lower one is the outturn target in 2030. You can see we are going off track. There is no debate about this. We can debate why. We can talk about the best way to get back on track. There is no argument that we are veering off track. That's despite what I just showed you in terms of Scotland's advantage on housing. And just to put it into numbers for you, so these are children in poverty after housing costs. We have a more demanding measure in Scotland. The blue bars are where they are by tenure. So 90,000 children in social rented housing, 50,000 in owner-occupied with a mortgage, 40,000 in the private rented sector. The red bars, though, are really important. They tell us that 50,000 children in poverty in Scotland are only there because of housing costs. So there's a great deal more we can do in both rented sectors to remove that additional risk that families face as a result of housing costs. Okay, let's move on and look in a bit more detail at the child poverty population, for want of a better word, in Scotland. Really important context, I think, for today's conversation. And there's another year's data to add to this, but it doesn't change the profile very much. So if we look at the 250,000 children below the poverty line as of last year, and ask what kind of households do they live in. And you can't see this, forgive me, but we can circulate it, and we've published these figures last year. This tells us what kind of households they live in. And what jumps out from this, a really familiar fact these days, 2/3 of children are in working households. But if you're in a working household and you're in poverty, probably it's because there's only one earner or because there's only part-time work in the household. If you have two full-time earners, your odds are against being on this chart. Okay? So one earner or only part-time earners and inadequate hours are what's driving in work poverty. 2/3 in work, 1/3 not. 50% of the children on this chart, fully 50%, are in working households with two parents, and 1/4 are in a single-parent household. But the really important other part of this chart, and it's about the colours for today's conversation, the purple side of the graph, 60% of those children are in households where there is no disability or limiting illness, but 40%, the pink side, are in a household where there is a disability or limiting illness. Overwhelmingly, that's one of the parents rather than the child. So there's a lot of thinking going on within government around the disability employment gap. There is no pathway to solving child poverty in Scotland without a fundamentally different offer to single parents, to mothers, and to disabled people. So we have to think equalities if we're going to break some of the locks that we saw earlier. Let me just say a word about the general election. We kind of decided to dabble in politics this year in a very even-handed, independent way. We always say we're independent but not neutral. We're not neutral about what's driving in poverty and how to solve it. But we did look at some priorities for low-income voters ahead of the election. And this is the cut of the data for Scotland. Not published yet for Scotland, but we can share the survey results with you. And, a big enough sample for Scotland to say something significant. And this shows people on low incomes. They're not all in poverty, but they are on low incomes. And then other Scots who live above that low income threshold. And these are the priorities in order. And you can compare how low income Scots compare with the rest of the population. And what you can see in that middle column is, not surprisingly, it's the cost of living and health, it's the economy, and then housing, poverty and social security. Those last three all more important, again not surprisingly, to those folks than they are to Scots as a whole. And if I have to use the B word, you'll see that the B word ranks 9th for low-income Scots as the most important issue ahead of the election, compared to 4th for the rest of us. So a really material set of concerns, and why wouldn't it be for low-income Scots? I'll come back in a moment to say a bit more about the world of work for those folks. Just a quick word on progression, because if 2/3 of the issue we're talking about today is about working households, we have to, in the next decade, recast entirely how we understand and address this challenge. The Resolution Foundation, who've done some great work on this, tell us that in Scotland, in the last decade, if you started off in a low-paid job, your odds of escaping low pay entirely across a decade were 1 in 5. So the narrative of the labour market as an escalator simply isn't true if you're starting off in a low-paid entry-level job. Unless you're a graduate doing it short-term, there are very few escape routes. Long-term, for people who are in those sectors. So getting folks into work is base one. It really isn't the objective ultimately here. We also see from, and by the way I should say 1 in 5 in Scotland is marginally better than the story for the rest of the UK. We can also break this down by equalities groups and by employment sectors, and I won't go into detail, but the public sector, not surprisingly, does better. It maps on, to a large degree, onto living wage coverage, although it's not a perfect match. And certain groups of women, not all women, certain groups of women, certain BME groups, the majority but not all, and certainly people with disabilities are held back and in many ways are locked into jobs that are going nowhere with hours that are inadequate and without the training opportunities and representation and advocacy in the workplace that might help people to break this lock. A few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we also did some work at JRF looking at 5,000 working households who are in poverty. And we asked them the most important things to them that their employer or their workplace or the sector they're in could do to help create a horizon, improve their prospects at work. So after a pay rise, which was, of course, the most important thing to folks, here are the 3 things that people cared about most, and they're all about security and flexibility. Nothing surprising here, but I think that point about access to paid in-work training, relevant training on the job, and if your employer won't fund it, then we expect the public sector, through some kind of mixed funding model, to pick up the failures of the market and public policy historically. People care very much about this kind of opportunity, as well as flexibility, but also thinking long term. And this might be a little bit to do with the auto-enrolment debate on pensions. There are still lots and lots of workers in Scotland who are below the threshold and aren't covered by auto-enrolment. Many of them have mini jobs or they're self-employed, and so the job is far from done on long-term security for people who are in work but going nowhere. Let me just say something about some of the clues we've got, not just from evaluation evidence of working for families and Fair Start Scotland, and a real wealth, actually, of evaluation evidence around what works. Let me just say a bit about approaches and cultural orientations that I think are going to be really important for getting this fund to have maximum impact. So I just want to mention what I think is up there with the most important policy and practice books in the UK of this decade, which is Radical Help by Hilary Cottam. Why do I say that? Firstly, I don't read much, so I've probably only read 10 books this decade, but seriously, this is a really inspiring book that is very practical and tells the story of various demonstration approaches to trying to address some of the big dilemmas we face around health and working age and isolation. In England, a really troubling framing around troubled families, but we would all recognise families for whom a very large sum of money is spent on them, and virtually not a single penny of that has been consulted around how to design it. So we can spend £250,000 on different families and wonder why we're not an inch further forward in terms of their well-being. So that's what this book takes on, how we can use relationships to start to resolve these dilemmas. And the really hopeful thing about this is that it shows how we can achieve much better outcomes affordably, in some cases saving quite a lot of money. So where we do have new money, like this fund is, we ought to be raising the bar in terms of what we can achieve. So one really relevant example is the story in here of how different communities built their own job search networks. Job Centre Plus is not designed to find people jobs. Work coaches are not work coaches. Even the best work coaches, and we found lots of evidence in our work with Universal Credit in Glasgow, of excellent work coaches who build great relationships with claimants, but they're still not about finding work, usually. But when you do create new networks and affinity groups, which are focused on helping people to find appropriate, good jobs, this analysis finds outcomes tripled for 20% of the cost. We have to take this kind of evidence seriously, not just because of the economics of it, but because of the human progress that this kind of evidence tells us. And the equation, I've simplified it hugely, but the equation goes, you take some people who are isolated or been round the loop so many times and are so demotivated. 10 years ago I met a civil servant, not in Scotland, who told me the theory of change is keep chucking people at the labour market till they stick. What does that do for human motivation? And we wonder why, we twist again, new programme, why do we think it's going to work next time? It will work if we get the relationship side of it right, if we open up new network connections for people, and part of the network should be people who are in good jobs, who can share the know-how about those jobs and those sectors. In a way that, best will in the world, Job Centre Plus, career services just struggle to do. Let's put people who are doing these jobs in the driving seat alongside people who are seeking the jobs. And if you do that, then people can start to access opportunities that are appropriate for them. I'm simplifying, but these cultural traits are really important. And there are further examples in this book, not just this book, but elsewhere also. There'll be evidence from every part of Scotland about how this kind of stuff works as well. of enhancing capability and well-being in families and making sure they are prepared and equipped to take advantage of this kind of employability support fund. So really broad lessons learned from the last 20 years. Putting parents and actually wider households, whole families, at the heart of what we're doing. Let's stop pillar-to-post approaches to services. Let's stop doing signposting and warm handovers. Which one of us wants to be assessed, referred, tell our story, assessed, referred, and so it goes on. Again, really demotivating. The more we can embed multiple types of support in community settings where people go anyway, the closer we're going to get to not leaving people behind and getting it right. We know that consistency of support from key workers, but also from peers, and also new connections outside of peer groups in the workplace. So socialise it, make it relational. Use holistic tools to gauge where people are at in their lives. We're doing some work at the moment for the Edinburgh Poverty Commission. We've met parents recently who tell us they are funnelled into an employability programme. They're not quite ready for it, and then they're offered a set of interventions before they're really able to bridge into them. What are the more appropriate gateways in to families to help their readiness? So personalise it. Don't assume just because good work is the goal, that's always the best entry point for folks. Integrate it, address income max, cost and debt reduction, and so on. Transport is almost always the silent issue. It's always there in the background. It's hardly ever the number one issue that folks in poverty want to talk about, but it's almost always in the mix. And let's have a really good understanding of the way in which housing costs act as a barrier to people getting into work or increasing their hours. People, above all, prize predictability of income and hours. When things change, people in poverty almost always see it as a risk because it usually is a risk. We need to be de-risking work and extra employment and more hours. And then finally, I think we have to change our commissioning purposes. So what is to commission for fair work and to commission for reduction in work poverty? It should be about helping people to find jobs, whether that's their first or third or fifth move, which will be employment growth for those groups and the places we serve, but also earnings growth. Or it might be about more appropriate hours. Let's raise the bar on the job gains we can get from procurement. So when we looked across the OECD at cities that are doing a pretty good job in inclusive growth, and there are many, many different models, broadly, one new full-time job created with training for every £1 million of procurement. Doesn't sound very much. There are parts of Scotland running at a quarter of that level across all public sector procurement. We can do a lot more to maximise the gains of existing budgets before we even add in city, region and growth deals. So alignment. Quick final point on what else people tell us about the kind of work that they want. So going back to that survey of voters I mentioned earlier, I'm thinking about people who are on low wages or flexible contracts. Here are the things, and there's very little difference actually between low-income Scots and everyone else. Guaranteed hours at work. So the Living Hours campaign is coming to a place near you soon, following hard on the heels of living wage. Flexibility to work at times that suit, so important for parents and other carers, and people with limitations on their working hours due to illness or disability. More advance notice of hours, better compensation for cancelled shifts, more paid holidays. People are telling us the kind of working experience that they need, not just want. So, if the economy we have today is not a law of nature, it's not the weather, it's not the climate, We've designed it, we can redesign it to work for everyone, and our litmus test should be parents in Scotland who experience poverty. Thank you very much for listening.